In all my years carrying words between the species of the galaxy, I had translated 10,000 negotiations, and I had never once heard the word that broke the Galactic Council. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was the smallest word in any language I knew, and when the human said it plainly into the great chamber, I watched a body that had governed the galaxy for 9,000 years descend, in the space of an afternoon, into a panic it had no idea how to survive. The word was no, just that, no. And to understand why one syllable could shatter the council, you have to understand what the council was, and what it had never in 9,000 years encountered, which was someone who meant it. Let me tell you who I am, because the whole story passed through me literally word by word, and a translator sees a thing that no one else in the room can see. My name is Issa-Renu, and I am Ommat. You will not know my people well, so let me explain us, because the explaining is not a detour. It is the heart of why I, of all the beings in that chamber, understood what was happening before anyone else did, and why it frightened me more than it frightened them. The Ommat do not decide alone. I mean that as literally as it can be meant. We are a consensus species. Our minds are built at the deepest level for shared deliberation. When an Ommat faces a choice of any weight, we do not simply choose. We open ourselves to the others around us and we deliberate together, and the decision emerges from the group the way a current emerges from many drops of water. We have a sense for it, a kind of felt awareness of the leanings of those around us, and we settle, collectively, toward consensus, and only then do we act. It is how we have always lived. It is beautiful in its way. An Ommat is never alone in a decision, never bears the full weight of a choice by themselves. And it made us, across the long history of the galaxy, the perfect interpreters, because a being that naturally seeks the middle ground between many minds is a being well suited to carry words between species who would otherwise misunderstand each other into war. I want to tell you what it actually feels like to be Ommat, because you cannot understand my fear in that chamber unless you understand the ground I stood on. From the moment we are young, we are never quite alone inside our own choosing. There is always at the edge of awareness the soft pull of the others, what those around us lean toward, what the group is settling into, and we move with it, the way a fish moves with the school, not because we are told to, but because the moving together is the deepest comfort we know. An Ommat who is cut off from consensus, who must decide entirely alone, experiences something close to vertigo, a sick floating wrongness, the absence of the current that should be there to carry us. We do not have heroes in the human sense. We have no stories of the lone Ommat who stood against the crowd, because to us that is not a story of courage. It is a story of a sickness, of a mind severed from the thing that makes a mind whole. The greatest virtue among my people is the finding of the middle. The deepest wisdom is the discovery of the place where all the currents meet. We are, I think, the most reasonable species in the galaxy, and I say that now with a complicated grief, because the humans showed me that there is a thing that lives past reasonableness, on the far side of it, that my people have never once been able to reach. But it also meant that I, like all my people, found one thing nearly impossible to comprehend, a thing that sat at the very center of what happened in that chamber, the unilateral, unmovable no. An Ommat does not refuse. We do not have in our nature the capacity to plant ourselves on a single position and declare it non-negotiable against all comers. Everything to us is a current to be found, a consensus to be reached, a middle to be discovered. The idea that a being might look at a room full of pressure and simply say no and mean it and not move, that was as alien to me as my consensus mind would have been to a human. I had spent my whole life believing that everything could be negotiated, because for an Ommat everything must be. The galaxy had taught me the same lesson, 10,000 times over in 10,000 negotiations. Everything has a price. Everything is a current. There is always a middle. The humans taught me otherwise, and the teaching nearly destroyed the council, and then it saved it, and it changed forever how I understood what it means to have a self that cannot be moved. Let me set the scene, because the scene is everything. The Galactic Council met in the Convocation, a vast deliberative chamber at the heart of the Council Station, a place I had served in for most of my adult life. Picture a great tiered ring, species upon species seated in their delegations around a central floor, the air a careful blend that 100 kinds of lung could share, and everywhere the soft, constant work of governance, the proposals, the amendments, the endless patient negotiation by which the Council had kept the galaxy from tearing itself apart for 9,000 years, because that was what the Council was at its core. It was not an empire. It did not rule by force. It ruled by negotiation, by the deeply held 9,000-year-old conviction that any conflict, any crisis, any clash of interests could be resolved if the parties would only sit down and find the price, the compromise, the middle. The Council's whole power, its whole reason for existing, was the faith that everything was negotiable. That faith had ended wars. It had averted famines and partitioned disputed worlds and divided contested resources, and again, found the deal that let proud species step back from the brink. The Council was the machinery of compromise, and it had run smoothly for 90 centuries, because in all that time it had never once met a party that would not, in the end, deal. I want you to understand how proud the Council was of this, because the pride is part of what made the fall so steep. We did not think of ourselves as a body that traded away lives. We thought of ourselves as the great achievement of galactic civilization, the thing that had replaced war with words, slaughter with sessions, the raw taking of the strong with the patient bargaining of the reasonable. And there was truth in that pride. The Council really had ended wars. It really had saved more lives than it spent. The old delegates would tell the young ones in the quiet corridors off the Convocation that before the Council the galaxy had been a place of fire, of species erasing species, of the strong simply taking what they wished, and that the Council had built, on the wreckage of all that, a machine that turned conflict into negotiation, and that this machine was the most precious thing the galaxy had ever made. I believed it. I had given my life to it. I was an interpreter in the great machine of compromise, and I was proud of my small part in keeping the galaxy talking instead of burning. But there was a rot at the center of the pride, and I could not see it, because I was part of it, until a human made me see it. The rot was this: a machine that can negotiate anything will, eventually, negotiate everything, including the things that should never have a price. The Council had grown so good at finding the middle that it had forgotten there were places where the middle was an abomination. It had turned so many crises into deals that it no longer noticed when the thing being dealt away was the lives of people who had no seat at the table. The reasonableness had become a kind of blindness. We could look at several million beings about to die and feel, genuinely, that the responsible thing, the wise thing, the civilized thing, was to negotiate over how many of them we could afford to save, and to call the resulting compromise a success. We had replaced the fire with words, yes. But somewhere in 9,000 years of words, we had also learned to say, in the most reasonable and civilized voice imaginable, that some lives were a line item, and we had forgotten that this was a terrible thing to be able to say. I was the senior interpreter assigned to the human delegation. That is how I came to be at the center of it. The humans were new to the Council, a young species, recently admitted, still finding their place among the ancient powers, and they had requested an Ommat interpreter for the great matter that was coming, and I had been assigned, and I had been glad of it because the humans were interesting to me. They negotiated strangely. I had noticed it in the small matters, the early sessions. They were warm and reasonable, and they bargained hard but fairly, and they seemed in most things to understand the Council's way, the finding of the middle. I had thought them quick students of the galactic art of compromise. I did not yet understand that there was a line in them, invisible, that I had simply never happened to push against, and that on the far side of that line, the human who bargained warmly and reasonably became something the Council had no name for and no defense against. The crisis that brought us all to the emergency session was this. There was a world called Heth, on a contested frontier, and on Heth lived a population, several million, of a minor species called the Door, who were about to die, not in war. In a slower way, Heth sat in the path of a thing the Council called the encroachment, a vast slow stellar phenomenon, a wave of radiation and disruption rolling out from a dying star that would render Heth uninhabitable within a year. The Door could not evacuate themselves. They were a poor people without the ships. And the Council had convened in emergency session to decide what to do, because the only powers with the fleet capacity to evacuate several million Door in time were the great powers of the Council, and saving the Door would cost them ships, resources, time, the diversion of fleets from other purposes. And so the question of whether and how to save Heth had become, as everything in the Council became, a negotiation. I had seen the Door in the briefings, images of Heth, of the people who lived there. I want to tell you about them, just a little, because the rest of the chamber did not look at the images, and I did, and the looking is part of why I could not, in the end, stay on the Council's side of what happened. The Door were not a remarkable people. They lived in low clustered towns under Heth's pale sun, a people of potters and fishers and growers, and the images showed them going about ordinary lives, markets, children, the small business of a species that had never done anything to anyone, and had simply had the misfortune to be born in the path of a dying star, without the wealth to flee it. There was one image that stayed with me. A Door parent in a market, lifting a child to see over a stall, the child reaching for something bright. An ordinary moment on a world that had a year to live, photographed by some survey drone and filed into a briefing packet that the great powers would use to calculate how many such parents and children it was worth saving. I looked at that image for a long time, the night before the session. I did not yet know what to do with what it made me feel. The Council had trained that feeling out of most of us long ago. But I am Ommat, and we feel the currents of others keenly. And something in that image of a parent lifting a child reached across the distance and would not let me look away. And I think, looking back, that it prepared me to hear the human no as something other than madness. I want you to sit with the shape of the session, because it is the thing the humans could not abide, and the thing the rest of us found perfectly normal. Several million people were going to die, and the Council had gathered not to ask how do we save them, but to ask what is it worth to save them, and who pays, and what do they get in return, and whether perhaps it might be more efficient to save some and not others, and where the line should be drawn. To every species in that chamber, to me, to my consensus mind, to the ancient powers, to all of us, this was simply how things were done. A crisis was a negotiation. Lives were a variable in the negotiation. You found the middle. You always found the middle. The Door would not all be saved, certainly. That was never realistic. But some deal would be struck, some number of them rescued, some price paid by some powers in exchange for some concessions, and the matter would be resolved, regrettably, in the Council's eternal way. The deal on the table, when the humans entered the chamber, was nearly done. The great powers had negotiated it among themselves over days. It was, by the Council's standards, a good deal, an efficient deal. A coalition of powers would provide evacuation fleets sufficient to rescue a portion of the Door, in exchange for a set of concessions on the contested frontier, including the cession of certain other Door territories to the powers doing the rescuing. The number of Door to be saved had been calculated against the cost. It was not all of them. It was, I believe, a little under half, the rest to be left on Heth, because saving them all was deemed too expensive, and a deal that saved some was better than no deal at all, and this was, everyone agreed, the responsible and realistic outcome. I had translated parts of that negotiation in the days before, and I want to tell you the thing that haunts me most about it, which is how calm it was. There was no cruelty in the chamber. I want to be clear about that because it matters. The delegates who calculated that a little under half the Door could be saved were not monsters. They did not hate the Door. Several of them were, by any ordinary measure, decent and thoughtful beings who would have been horrified to be called murderers. They were simply doing the thing the council had trained all of us to do, the thing 9,000 years had made feel like wisdom. They were being reasonable. They were finding the middle. They spoke of the doomed door, the ones the deal would leave on Heth to die, in the gentle, regretful tones of people who genuinely wished it were otherwise, and then they returned, calmly, to the work of calculating the optimal number, because what else was there to do? The star was coming. The cost was real. Someone had to draw the line. It was sad, yes, but it was responsible. It was the deal. And the chamber was prepared to ratify it, with regret, the way it had ratified 1,000 such regrettable necessary deals across the long, reasonable centuries. A compromise, a middle, a price paid and a price extracted, lives saved and lives written off, all of it balanced and efficient and regrettable and done. And then the human delegate rose to speak, because the humans, as a council member, had a vote on the resolution, and I rose with her to carry her words, and I did not yet know that I was about to translate the syllable that would break the council. Her name was Delegate Carla Morno, and I had come to know her a little in the early sessions. A steady, thoughtful person, not loud, the kind of negotiator who listened more than she spoke. She rose, and the chamber gave her the courtesy of its attention, expecting, I think, a routine assent, perhaps a minor amendment, the small contribution of a junior member to a deal already made. And Delegate Morno looked around the great tiered ring of the convocation, at the assembled powers of the galaxy, at the resolution that would save some door and abandon the rest, and she spoke, and I carried her words into the chamber, and they were these. I've listened to 3 days of this, and I need to make sure I understand the resolution before us, because I want to be fair. The proposal is that we save a little under half the population of Heth and leave the rest to die, because saving all of them costs more than the powers doing the rescuing are willing to pay, and in exchange for saving the half we save, those powers receive territorial concessions from the door. Is that correct? Have I understood it? And the chamber confirmed that she had understood it correctly, because she had, and there was no shame in the confirmation, because to the council this was simply the shape of a responsible resolution. I carried the confirmations to her. And Delegate Morno was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing that began it all, and I felt my consensus mind recoil from it even as my voice carried it faithfully into the chamber, because it was a thing my people could not have said and could barely understand. She said, "Then I'm sorry, but humanity can't agree to this. Not a version of it, not an amended version, not a better-priced version. We're not going to negotiate over which of those people lives. We'll commit our own fleets to the evacuation, everything we have, but we will not sign a resolution that decides in advance how many millions of them we're allowed to abandon. There's no number we'll agree to. The answer to how many do we leave to die is none. We're not negotiating that. We're just not. We're not negotiating that. We're just not." I carried the words into the chamber, and I felt the chamber not understand them. That was the first thing, not anger, not yet. Incomprehension, because Delegate Morno had said a thing that did not compute in the 9,000-year-old machinery of the council. She had not proposed a different deal. She had not held out for better terms. She had refused the category itself. She had said that there was a thing that was not negotiable, that had no price, that no amount of concession could move her on and the council, which ran entirely on the conviction that everything was negotiable, that there was always a middle, that any party would eventually deal, simply did not have a place to put what she had said. It was as if she had spoken a word in a language the chamber did not contain. And then the incomprehension began, slowly, to turn into something else, because the great powers realized that she meant it, and a non-negotiable party in a body that runs on negotiation is not an inconvenience. It is an existential threat, a thing that breaks the whole machine, and as that realization spread through the tiered ring of the convocation, I watched the Galactic Council, the calm and ancient governor of the galaxy, begin its slow descent into a panic I would not have believed possible. All of it set off by one young delegate from one minor world saying, simply, that some things do not have a price. Let me tell you what happened next. Let me tell you how a chamber that had negotiated its way through 9,000 years of crises came apart at the seams when faced with the one thing it could not negotiate. And why, by the end, a consensus-minded interpreter who had believed her whole life that everything could be moved came to understand that the most powerful thing in the galaxy is a being who has found the one thing they will not move on, and planted themselves on it, and said no. But first you had to understand the council, and the deal, and the millions on Heth whose lives were a line item in a resolution, because the humans did not refuse to negotiate out of stubbornness. They refused because someone, finally, in a chamber that had forgotten how, had looked at the line item and remembered that it was people. The panic did not come all at once. Panic in a body of ancient powers is not like panic in a crowd. It is slower and quieter and far more frightening to watch, because it happens behind faces that have spent millennia learning never to show anything at all. The first response to Delegate Morno's refusal was procedural, and I should explain it, because the procedure is where I first saw the machine begin to fail. The speaker of the convocation, an ancient Sol, a being who had presided over the chamber for longer than the human species had been spacefaring, acknowledged the human statement, and did the thing the council always did with a difficult position. He treated it as an opening bid. He thanked Delegate Morno for her principled stand, and then he moved smoothly to incorporate it into the negotiation, the way the council had incorporated 1,000,000 principled stands before. Perhaps, the speaker suggested, the human concern could be addressed by adjusting the number, saving somewhat more of the door, in exchange for somewhat greater concessions, finding a figure closer to the human position. He was offering to move the line. That was the council's reflex, its deepest instinct, the thing it had done flawlessly for 9,000 years. When a party objects to where the line is drawn, you negotiate over where to draw it. The speaker was certain, I could feel it, that this was simply a matter of finding the human's true number. Because everyone had a true number in the end, everyone could be moved to a middle. That was the whole foundation of the council and the whole experience of 90 centuries. And Delegate Morno said, I think you misunderstood me, Speaker, and I want to be very clear so there's no confusion, because this matters too much for confusion. I'm not asking you to move the line. I'm telling you that humanity will not vote for any resolution that has a line in it. There is no number of abandoned people will agree to. Not half, not a quarter, not one. The moment the resolution says, we will save this many and leave the rest, we vote no. And we keep voting no, no matter what you offer us, because the thing we object to isn't the number. It's the line. It's the idea that we're sitting here deciding how many living people we're allowed to write off to make a deal more affordable. We won't do it. There's nothing you can offer that makes us do it, because the thing you'd be offering us is a smaller atrocity, and we're not in the market for atrocities of any size. I carried those words into the chamber, and I felt the speaker fail to understand them, and then I felt him understand them. And the difference between those two moments was the difference between a council that worked and a council that was about to come apart. Because the speaker had offered the human a better deal, and the human had said the existence of the deal was the problem. And that broke something. The speaker had no procedure for it. In 9,000 years, every objection in the convocation had been an objection to terms, and every objection to terms could be met by adjusting terms. The council was, at its heart, a machine for adjusting terms. And Delegate Morno had just told the machine that she objected not to the terms, but to the existence of terms, to the whole frame, to the very act of pricing the unpriceable. And the machine had no gear for that, no lever, no response, because you cannot negotiate with someone over whether negotiation itself is permissible. The thing she had refused was the one thing the council did not know how to put on the table, because it was the table. I watched the realization move through the great tiered ring. The ancient powers, who had sat through the humans' first statement with the patient condescension of the strong, began, one by one, to go still in a new way, because they were beginning to grasp the shape of the problem, and the shape of the problem was catastrophic. A council resolution required consensus, not unanimity, but a broad consensus, and certain resolutions, the great ones, the ones that committed fleets and ceded territories, required the assent of all the major members. And humanity, newly admitted, was now a major member with a vote. And humanity had just announced that it would withhold that vote from any version of the deal forever, on principle. The deal could not pass without the humans. The humans would not pass any deal that abandoned anyone. And the star was coming, and the clock was running, and the council, the great machine of compromise, had just discovered that it contained a member who could not be compromised, and that this member's refusal had locked the entire machine. That was when the panic began. And I want to describe it carefully, because it was the most instructive thing I have ever witnessed. The slow unraveling of the most reasonable body in the galaxy when faced with the one thing reasonableness could not metabolize. The first stage was bewildered fury. Several of the great powers turned on the humans, not with threats. The council did not do threats, but with a rising tide of incredulous argument. Did the humans not understand that their refusal would doom everyone? That by refusing to accept a deal that saved half, they were ensuring that none would be saved, because without a resolution there would be no coordinated evacuation at all. Were the humans so attached to their principle that they would let all the door die rather than agree to save some? It was an old argument, the oldest argument the reasonable make against the immovable, and it was, on its face, devastating. Your principle will kill the very people you claim to be protecting. The humans were being accused with real heat of moral vanity, of valuing their own clean hands over the lives the deal would save. And I confess that even I, carrying the words, felt the force of it. It seemed unanswerable. Surely saving half was better than saving none. Surely the human no was a luxury that the doomed door could not afford. And Delegate Morno answered it, and her answer was the thing that began to turn the panic from fury into something worse, something closer to terror, because it exposed the lie at the center of the chamber's reasonableness. She said, "You're telling me that if I don't agree to abandon half of them, all of them will die. But that's not actually true, is it? That's the story this body tells itself so it can keep drawing lines and calling it wisdom. The reason save half is the deal isn't that saving all of them is impossible. It's that saving all of them costs more than the powers in this room want to pay, and the territorial concessions are smaller. Save half isn't the limit of what's possible. It's the limit of what's profitable. You've spent 3 days negotiating down from save everyone to save half, not because the star made you, but because each power at this table wanted to give less and get more, and half is where your haggling happened to land. And now you're telling me that half is a hard physical reality, and my refusal to accept it is what's killing people. It isn't. Your unwillingness to pay full price is what's killing people. I'm just the first one in 9,000 years who won't help you pretend otherwise." The chamber went silent. I carried the words, and then there was silence, and it was a different silence than before, because Delegate Morno had just said the unsayable thing, the thing under the thing, the truth that the council's whole reasonable machinery existed to keep no one from saying. She had told the great powers that the necessity they hid behind was not necessity at all, that the line they drew with such regret was drawn not by the star, but by their own unwillingness to pay, and that they had been calling their stinginess realism for so long that they had forgotten it was a choice. She had refused to let the abandonment of the door be laundered into a tragic inevitability. She had named it as what it was, a decision made by the comfortable about how much someone else's survival was worth. And that was when the panic became real, because the great powers understood, all at once, that the human was not going to let them have the story. For 9,000 years, the council had been able to do terrible things and feel good about them, because it always had the story that the compromise was necessary, that the line was forced, that the reasonable middle was the best anyone could do, that the dead were a tragedy and not a choice. The story was the thing that let the machine run without anyone in it having to feel like a murderer. And the human had walked into the chamber and simply refused to accept the story. And worse, she had said it out loud in open session in front of everyone, so that the story could not be quietly maintained. Every delegate in that ring now had to sit with the thing the human had said, that they were not trapped by necessity, but choosing for profit how many millions to let die. You cannot unhear that. And a body that has built its entire self-image on being reasonable and wise cannot survive being shown, in front of itself, that its reasonableness is a costume worn over ordinary greed. The fury collapsed into something I had never seen in the convocation. Delegates began speaking over each other. The ancient decorum of the chamber, the thing that had held for 90 centuries, frayed and then tore. Some powers demanded the humans be censured, stripped of their vote, expelled. But there was no procedure for expelling a member for refusing to agree to something, because no member had ever done it. Some powers turned on each other, the careful coalition that had built the deal beginning to fracture as the humans' words made each of them look, suddenly, at what they had been about to ratify. Some delegates fell silent and would not speak at all, and I could feel with my Ommat sense, the currents in the room churning, no consensus anywhere, the deliberative body that had always found its way to a middle now thrashing in genuine chaos, because the human had removed the middle, had stood on the one point that had no other side, and the whole machine was tearing itself apart against the immovable fact of her refusal. And the speaker, the ancient Saul who had presided over the convocation for longer than I had been alive, rose finally and called for order and did not get it and called again, and his voice, when it came through to the chamber, had a thing in it I had never heard from him. Fear. Real fear. The fear of a being who has presided over the great machine of the galaxy and just watched it seize, and does not know how to start it again, because the thing that has stopped it is not a thing the machine was ever built to handle. He looked across the chaos of the chamber to the human delegation, to Delegate Morno standing calm in the storm she had caused, and he said, and I carried it and I will never forget it, he said, "Delegate, you are one member, one vote, a young species newly admitted. You cannot possibly intend to hold the entire council hostage to a principle. Tell me your price. There is always a price. In 9,000 years there has always been a price. Tell me yours and let us end this and save who we can. There is always a price." And Delegate Morno looked at the speaker across the broken chamber, and she did not raise her voice, and she said the thing that I have built the rest of my life around, the thing that finally taught a consensus-minded interpreter what it was she had been carrying words past, all those years, without ever once being able to feel it. She said, "That's the whole problem, speaker. You think I have a price because you've never met anyone who didn't. 9,000 years and everyone always had a price, so you built a galaxy on the idea that everyone always will. But there are things that don't have one. There just are. And a body that's forgotten that, a body that thinks the lives of a few million people who aren't in the room are a number to be haggled over, that body isn't wise. It's sick. It's been sick for so long it thinks the sickness is wisdom." She paused, and the chamber was silent, hanging on the words I carried. I don't have a price. Not because I'm stubborn, because some things are not for sale, and the moment you agree they are, you've already lost the thing that made you worth saving. I'm not holding the council hostage. I'm holding a door open. And I'm going to keep holding it open and saying no until this body remembers that the question was never, how many can we afford to save? The question was always, how do we save them? You just stopped asking it 9,000 years ago because the other question was easier. So I'm asking it for you. How do we save them, all of them? Start there and I'll negotiate every detail of how. But the number of people we abandon is not a detail, and it's not for sale, and it never was. The chamber did not answer. It could not answer. And I stood there, Ommat, consensus-minded, a being who had believed her whole life that everything was a current to be found, and I felt, for the first time, the thing my people had never been able to feel, the thing I had spent my whole career translating without comprehending, the solid ground of a self that would not move. It was not stubbornness. I understood that now. It was the opposite of the sickness. It was the one fixed point in a galaxy that had been negotiating its way, reasonably, civilly, for 9,000 years, straight into the abandonment of its own. The Council had descended into panic, and the panic was not the end of the story. Because a body cannot stay in panic forever, and what the Council did when the panic finally broke, what the human refusal forced it to become, is the last part, and the part that turned a story about a no into a story about what that no made possible. Let me tell you what happened when the most reasonable body in the galaxy was finally forced, by one immovable human, to ask the question it had stopped asking 9,000 years ago. A body in panic cannot stay in panic. It either tears itself apart, or it finds, in the breaking, a thing it could not find any other way. The Galactic Council, in the hours after Delegate Morno's refusal, very nearly did the first. What saved it, what saved the door, what changed the galaxy, was that the human kept the door open long enough for the second to happen. Let me tell you what the panic actually broke open, because it is the heart of everything, and it is the thing the histories miss when they tell this story as a tale of human stubbornness defeating an empire. The human did not defeat the Council. The human refused to let the Council take the easy way out, and in refusing, she forced the Council to do a thing it had not done in 9,000 years, which was to actually try. Here is what I mean. For 3 days before the humans spoke, the great powers had been negotiating downward, from save everyone, which was raised once and dismissed as unrealistic, towards save half, which was where the haggling settled. And the crucial thing, the thing Delegate Morno had seen and named, was that no one had ever seriously worked the other problem. No one had sat down and asked, with the full ingenuity of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, how could we actually save all of them? Because that question had been foreclosed at the very start, dismissed as unrealistic, and once it was foreclosed, all the brilliance of the chamber had gone into the negotiation, into the haggling over the number, into the careful division of an assumed scarcity. The Council had spent 3 days being clever about how to divide the loss. It had spent no time at all being clever about how to prevent it. The cleverness was real. These were ancient, capable, resource-rich civilizations. But it had all been pointed at the wrong question, because the wrong question was the easy one, and the easy one let everyone pay less. And when the human no locked the machine, when the easy answer, save half and deal, became impossible because the humans would never ratify it, the chamber was left with only 2 paths. It could tear itself apart, fail entirely, save no one and collapse into recrimination. Or it could, for the first time in 9,000 years, turn the full force of its enormous collective genius onto the question it had foreclosed at the start. How do we save all of them? It took the rest of that day and most of the next, and I was there for all of it, and it was the most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed, because I watched the most reasonable body in the galaxy discover that its reasonableness had been laziness wearing a wise face. Once the easy exit was closed, once, abandon some of them was off the table, held off by the immovable human, the chamber's brilliance had nowhere to go but the hard problem, and the hard problem, it turned out, was not actually impossible. It had only been more expensive and more difficult and more demanding of cooperation than the great powers had wanted to give. When they were finally forced to solve it, they could. The solutions came once the chamber stopped haggling and started building. One power had transport capacity it had been holding in reserve as a bargaining chip, never offered because offering it would have weakened their negotiating position. But with negotiation foreclosed, there was no position to protect, and the capacity came onto the table. Another power had been understating its available fleets to keep its concessions low. With the deal-making dead, the understatement had no purpose, and the true numbers emerged, and they were larger. A third power proposed a staging method, a relay of evacuation, that no one had bothered to develop because the half-measure deal had not required it, and once developed, it doubled the throughput of every ship involved. Piece by piece, hour by hour, the chamber assembled, out of capacity that had been hidden by negotiation and ingenuity that had been wasted on division, a plan to evacuate all of HFY, every door. The thing that had been declared unrealistic at the start of the session turned out to be entirely realistic. The moment the great powers stopped being allowed to profit from declaring it impossible. I want to be precise about what this means, because it is the whole lesson. The Council had been about to abandon several million people, not because saving them was impossible, but because the structure of negotiation rewarded everyone for pretending it was. Every power had an incentive to understate what it could give and overstate what saving everyone would cost, because that was how you negotiated a better deal, and when everyone negotiated that way, the collective lie became the truth, that only half could be saved. The human refusal did not add a single ship to the galaxy. It changed nothing about what was physically possible. All it did was remove the incentive to lie, by making the lie useless, by closing the easy exit that the lie was built to reach. And the instant the lie became useless, the truth emerged, and the truth was that the galaxy had always had more than enough to save everyone, and had simply been negotiating its way out of doing so. The resolution that finally passed, and it did pass in the end with the human vote, because once it saved everyone, the humans negotiated every detail of it with the same warm, hard fairness they had shown in the small matters. The resolution that passed evacuated the entire population of HFY. All of them. The parent in the market. The child reaching for the bright thing. All of them lifted off a dying world and resettled, at a cost that the great powers, forced to actually pay it, discovered they could easily bear. It was the largest rescue in the history of the Council. And it had been made possible not by a weapon, not by a threat, not by human power of any kind, but by a single young delegate who had looked at the easy, reasonable, murderous deal and said no, and meant it, and held the door open against the entire weight of 9,000 years until the galaxy was forced to walk through it. The Council changed after HFY, not all at once. Bodies that old do not change all at once, but it changed. Because the thing the human had exposed could not be unexposed. That the Council's reasonableness had become a machine for laundering greed into necessity. That we can only save half had meant we only want to pay for half, for longer than anyone could remember. That the great machine of compromise had been quietly compromising away the lives of the unrepresented for 90 centuries, and calling it wisdom. Once that was visible, once one immovable member had made it visible in open session in front of everyone, the Council could not fully go back to the old way. Delegations began here and there to ask the foreclosed question, to work the hard problem before settling for the easy loss, to notice when impossible really meant unprofitable. It was not a revolution. It was something slower and more durable. The introduction into the oldest deliberative body in the galaxy of a single new idea, which was that some things are not for sale, and that a body which has forgotten this is not wise but sick. The humans had brought that idea into the chamber, and it did not leave. And I changed too. That is the part of the story that is mine, and the reason I am the one telling it. I was Ommat. I had believed my whole life, with the deep certainty of my whole consensus-minded people, that everything was a current to be found, that the wise being sought always the middle, that the unmovable position was a kind of sickness, a mind cut off from the saving flow of the group. And I had stood in that chamber and watched a human take an unmovable position and discovered that I had had it exactly backwards, that the sickness was not in the one who would not move, but in the body that could move anywhere, that had no fixed point, that would negotiate its way to any horror if the horror were divided into small enough reasonable steps. My people's gift, the finding of the middle, was a real gift. But it had a shadow, and the shadow was that a being who can always find the middle can be moved, by patient reasonable degrees, to a place they would never have walked to in a single step. The humans had a thing my people lacked, a thing I had spent my life unable even to perceive: a floor. A place past which they would not be moved by any argument, by any pressure, by any reasonable-sounding series of small concessions. And I understood, watching Delegate Morno hold that floor against the whole weight of the council, that a floor is not the opposite of wisdom. A floor is what wisdom stands on. Without it, all your reasonableness is just a long, smooth slope, and you will slide down it gracefully, agreeing at every step, all the way to the bottom. I left the council in time, and I went to learn from the humans, and Ommat seeking to understand the thing my people could not do, the planting of the self on solid ground. It was hard for me. It is hard for me still. My nature pulls always toward the current, the consensus, the middle. I cannot fully change what I am. But I have learned to ask, when I feel myself being moved, the question the human taught the council to ask, not where is the middle, but is this a thing that should have a middle at all? Some things should. Most things should. The council's gift was real. The finding of the middle has saved the galaxy more often than it has damned it. But some things should not, and the wisdom, the thing my reasonable people had never learned, the thing the humans carried, is in knowing the difference, and in having, somewhere in yourself, a floor you will not be reasoned off of, no matter how reasonable the voice that asks you to step down. I saw Delegate Morno once more, years later. She was old by then, retired from the council, and I found her, and I told her what she had taught me, the Ommat who had carried her impossible word into the chamber and felt his whole reasonable world reorder around it. And she was quiet, and then she said the thing I will end with, because it is the truest thing anyone ever taught me. She said, "It wasn't strength, you know. Everyone thinks I was being strong, holding the line against the whole council. I wasn't. I was scared the whole time. I almost folded a dozen times. It would have been so easy, and they made it sound so reasonable, and a part of me kept whispering that saving half was better than nothing, that I was being a fool, that the blood of everyone who died would be on my stubbornness." She paused. The thing that held wasn't strength. It was that I'd decided, a long time before I ever walked into that chamber, that there were some things I wouldn't trade no matter what. I decided it when it was easy, when nothing was at stake, so that when it was hard, when everything was at stake and every reasonable voice in the room was telling me to bend, the decision was already made. That's the only trick there is. You don't find your floor in the moment you need it. You build it long before in the quiet when no one's pushing, so it's there to stand on when everyone is. She smiled, tired and kind. The council thought I was refusing to negotiate. I wasn't. I was just negotiating from a floor instead of a slope. That's all a floor is. It's the place you negotiate from, instead of the place you slide to. Humans refused to negotiate, and the Galactic Council descended into panic. That is how the story is told, and it is true as far as it goes. But it is not the whole truth, and the whole truth is the thing I have given my life to carrying, the way I once carried words across the chamber. The humans did not refuse to negotiate. They negotiated harder than anyone, over every ship and every detail of how to save all of Hev. What they refused, the one thing, the only thing, was to put a price on the lives of people who were not in the room to defend themselves. They refused to let the abandonment of the helpless be laundered into a reasonable compromise. They stood on a floor, and they held it, against the whole patient reasonable weight of 9,000 years, until the galaxy remembered that it had one too. That is the most powerful thing I have ever seen. Not a fleet, not a weapon. One person, scared the whole time, who had built a floor in the quiet years before and stood on it when it counted and would not be moved, and saved a world by refusing, simply refusing, to agree that some lives were for sale. I am Ommat. I will always feel the pull of the current, but I have a floor now. The humans gave it to me, and I have spent the rest of my life learning to stand on it.